And the classical story that I sometimes tell in my classes to illustrate this is um, Rome started out as a monarchy. They had kings. They were kind of happy with their kings. Around 500 BC, they held a revolution and they kicked out the kings. And one of the guys who played a key role in this was a man named Lucius Junius Brutus. Okay? 500 years later, 500 years down the road, a guy comes along, Julius Caesar, who starts to act like a king. So if you have trouble with kings in Roman society, who are you gonna call? Somebody named Brutus. As it happens, there is a guy named Brutus in Roman society at this time who was one of Julius Caesar's best friends, Marcus Junius Brutus. Now, before I go further with the story, and I think you probably know where it ends, I just talk about how important your ancestors are in Roman culture. I mean, if you went to an aristocratic Roman's house and opened the front door and walked in, the first thing you would see would be a big wooden cabinet. And if you open that up, what you would see would be row after row of wax, death masks. So when a Roman aristocrat died, they literally put hot wax on his face and made an impression of his face in that way. And they hung these in a big cabinet right inside the front door. So every time you entered your house, you were literally staring at the faces of your ancestors. And every child in that family would have obsessively memorized every accomplishment of every one of those ancestors. You would know their career, what offices they held, what battles they fought in, what they did. When somebody new in the family died, there would be a big funeral, and they would talk about all the things their ancestors had did. The kids in the family would literally take out those masks, tie them onto their own faces, and wear them in the funeral procession. So you were like wearing the face of your ancestors. So you as an individual weren't important. You were just the latest iteration of that family. And there was enormous weight, huge weight, to live up to the deeds of your ancestors. So the Romans were absolutely obsessed with their past, especially with your own family. Every Roman kid who is, let's say, an aristocrat family could tell you every one of his ancestors back centuries. I can't go beyond my grandparents, but that's 800 years. So it's a completely different attitude towards the past.
And the level of celebration that we have now of the ancestors, even the ones we can name, is not as intense as it was.
No, I mean, it was obsessive and oppressive. It did.
Oh.
Yes, because there's that weight for you to act like your ancestors did.
Do you think, not to speak sort of philosophically, but do you think it was limiting to the way the society develops to be deeply constrained by the limiting in a good way or a bad way, you think?
Your W-2 and all your taxes 100% paid. Plus, get your biggest refund. File free now. Roughly 37% of filers qualify. See form 1040 returns only. Click eligibility.
Like everything, it's a little both good and bad. So on the one hand, it gives them enormous strength. It gives them this enormous connection. It gives them guidance. But the negatives, what's interesting, is it makes the Romans extremely traditional-minded and extremely conservative. I mean conservative in the sense of resistant to change. So in the late Republic, which we're going to talk about later, Rome desperately needed to change certain things. It was a society that did things the way the ancestors did it, and they did make some obvious changes which might have saved their republic. So that's the downside, is that it locks you into something and you can't change. To get us back to the Brutuses, so 500 years after that first Brutus got rid of kings, Julius Caesar starts to act like a king. One of his best friends is Marcus Junius Brutus, and literally in the middle of the night, people go to Brutus's house and write graffiti on it that says, "Remember your ancestor." And I want to say, thank God, you're no real Brutus. And at that point, he really has no choice. He forms a conspiracy, and on the Ides of March 44 BC, he and 23 other senators take daggers, stick them in Julius Caesar, and kill him for acting like a king. So the way I always pose this to my students is, how many of you would stick a knife in your best friend because of what your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather did? That's commitment. That's the power of the past. Yeah, that's a society where the past isn't just influential, but it dictates what you do. And that concept, I think, is very alien to us today. We can't imagine murdering our best friend because of what some incredibly distant ancestor did 500 years ago. But to Brutus, there is no choice. You have to do that. And a lot of societies have this power in the past. Today, not so much, but some still do. About a decade ago, I was in Serbia, and I was talking to some of the people there about the breakup of Yugoslavia and some of the wars that had taken place where people turned against their neighbors, basically murdered people they had lived next to for decades. And when I was talking to them, some of them actually brought up things like, oh, well, it was justified because in this battle in 12 whatever, they did this. I was thinking, you're citing something from 800 years ago to justify your actions today. That's a modern person who still understands the power of the past, or maybe is, crippled by it. Is another way to view it.
So this is an interesting point and an interesting perspective to remember about the way the Romans thought, especially in the context of how power is transferred, whether it's hereditary or not, which changes throughout Roman history. So it's interesting. It's interesting to remember that, the value of the ancestors.
Yep. And just the weight of tradition. For the Romans, the mos maiorum is Latin term, which means the way the ancestors did it. And it's kind of their word for tradition. So for them, tradition is what your forefathers and mothers did. And you have to follow that example, and you have to live up to that.
Does that mean that class mobility was difficult? So if your ancestors were farmers, there was a major constraint on remaining a farmer, essentially?
I mean, the Romans all like to think of themselves as farmers, even filthy rich Romans. It was just their national identity, is the citizen soldier farmer thing. But it did, among the aristocrats, the people who kind of ran things, yeah, it was hard to break into that if you didn't have famous ancestors. And it was such a big deal that there was a specific term called a novus homo, a new man, for someone who was the first person in their family to get elected to a major office in the Roman government, because that was a weird and different and new thing. So you actually designated them by this special term. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
So if we may, let us zoom out. It would help me, maybe it'll help the audience to look at the different periods that we've been talking about. So you mentioned the Republic, you mentioned maybe when it took a form of empire, maybe there was the Age of Kings. What are the different periods of this Roman, let's call it, the big
Roman history.
Roman history. Yeah. And a lot of people just call that whole period empire, loosely, right? So can you speak to the different periods?
Yes, absolutely. So conventionally, Roman history is divided into 3 chronological periods. The first of those is from 773 BC to 509 BC, which is called the monarchy. So all the periods get their names from the form of government. So this is the earliest phase of Roman history. It's when Rome is mostly just a fairly undistinguished little collection of mud huts, honestly, just like dozens of other cities of little mud huts in Italy. So that early phase, about 750 to around 500 BC, is the monarchy. They're ruled by kings. Then there's this revolution. They kick out the kings. They become a republic. That lasts from 500 BC roughly to about either 31 or 27 BC, depending on the date you pick is most important, 500 years. And the republic is when they have a republican form of government. Some people idealize this as Rome's greatest period, and the big thing in that period is Rome first expands to conquer all of Italy. First 250 years of that 500-year stretch, and then the second 250 years they conquer all the Mediterranean basin, roughly. So this is this time of enormous, successful Roman conquest and expansion. And then you have another switch up, and they become ruled by emperors. So back to the idea of one guy in charge. The Romans try to pretend it's not like a king, it's something else. You can get it now. But they're very touchy about kings. So they have emperors. Roman Empire, the first emperor is Augustus. Starts off as Octavian, which is named Augustus, when he becomes emperor. He kind of sets the model for what happens. And then, how long does the Roman Empire last? That's one of those great questions. The conventional answer is usually sometime in the 5th century, so the 400s AD, so about another 500 years, let's say. A nice kind of even division. 500 years of republic, 500 years of empire, but you can make very good cases for lots of other dates for the end of the Roman Empire. which I think goes all the way to the end of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, so another 1,500 years, but that's a whole other discussion. But so that's your three phases of Roman history.
And in some fundamental way, it still persists today, given how much of its ideas define our modern life, especially in the Western world.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the relationship between ancient Greece and Roman Empire, both in the chronological sense and in the influence sense?
I mean, ancient Greece comes, the classical era of Greek civilization is around the 500s BC. That's when you have the great achievements of Athens. It becomes the first sort of true democracy. They defeat the Persian invasions. A lot of famous stuff happens around in the 400s, let's say. So that is contemporaneous with Rome, but the Greek civilization sense is peaking earlier. And one of the things that happens is that Greece ends up being conquered by Rome in that second half of the Roman Republic between 250 and about 30 BC. And so Greece falls under the control of Rome, and Rome is very heavily influenced by Greek culture. They themselves see the Greeks as a superior civilization, culturally more sophisticated, great art, great philosophy, all this. And another thing about the Romans is they're super competitive. So one of the things one of the engines that drives Romans is this public competitiveness, especially among the upper classes. They care more about their status and standing among their peers than they do about money or even their own life. So there's this intense competition. And when they conquer Greece, Greek culture just becomes one more arena of competition. So Romans will start to learn Greek. They'll start to memorize Homer. They'll start to see who can quote more passages of Homer in Greek in their letters to one another, because that increases their status. So Rome kind of absorbs Greek civilization, and then the two get fused together. The other thing I should mention in terms of influences that's really huge on Rome is the Etruscans. And this is one that comes along before the Greeks. So the Etruscans were this kind of mysterious culture that flourished in northern Italy before the Romans, so way back 800 BC. They were much more powerful than the Romans. They were kind of a loose confederation of states. For a while, the Romans even seemed to have been under Etruscan control. The last of the Roman kings was really an Etruscan guy, pretty clearly. But the Etruscans end up giving to Rome, or you could say Rome ends up stealing, perhaps, a lot of elements of Etruscan culture. And many of the things that we today think of as distinctively Roman, as our cliches of what a Roman is, actually aren't truly Roman. They're stuff they stole from the Etruscans. So just a couple examples. The toga. What do you think of a Roman? It's a guy wearing a toga, and the toga is the mark of a Roman citizen. Well, that's what Etruscan kings wore, probably. Gladiator games. We associate those very intensely with the Romans. Well, they probably stole that from the Etruscans. A lot of Roman religion. Jupiter is a thunder god. All sorts of divination. The Romans love to, chop open animals and look at their livers and predict the future. That comes from the Etruscans. Watching the flight of birds to predict the future. That comes from the Etruscans. So there's a lot of central elements of what we think of as Roman civilization, which actually are borrowings, let's say, from these older, slightly mysterious Etruscans.
I mean, that's a really powerful thing. That's a powerful aspect of a civilization, to be able to, we can call it stealing, which is a negative connotation. We can also see its integration. Basically, yes, steal the best stuff from the peoples you conquer or the peoples that you interact with. That's not every empire does that. There's a lot of nations and empires that when they conquer, they annihilate versus integrate. So it's an interesting thing to be able to culturally, like the form that the competitiveness takes is that you want to compete in the realm of ideas and culture versus compete strictly in the realm of military conquest.
Yeah, and I think you've exactly put your finger on one of the, let's say, secrets of Rome's success, which is that they're very good at integrating non-Romans or non-Roman ideas and kind of absorbing them. So one of the things that's absolutely crucial early in Roman history, when they're just one of these tiny little mud hut villages fighting dozens of other mud hut villages in Italy, why does Rome emerge as the dominant? Well, one of the things they do is when they do finally succeed in conquering somebody else, let's say another Italianate people, they do something very unusual, because the normal procedure in the ancient world is you conquer let's say you conquer another city. You often kill most of the men, enslave the women and children, steal all the stuff, right? The Romans, at least with the Italians, conquer the other city, and sometimes they'll do that, but sometimes they'll also then say, all right, we're going to now leave you alone, and we're going to share with you a degree of Roman citizenship. Sometimes they make them full citizens. More often they make them something we call half citizens, which is kind of what it sounds like. You get some of the privileges of citizenship, not all of them. Sometimes they would just make them allies. But they would sort of incorporate them into the Roman project. And they wouldn't necessarily ask for money or taxes, which is weird too. But instead, the one thing they would always demand from the conquered cities in Italy is that they provide troops to the Roman army. So the army becomes this mechanism of Romanization, where you pull in foreigners, you make them like you, and then they end up fighting for you. And early on, the secret to Rome's military success is not that they have better generals, it's not that they have better equipment, it's not that they have better strategy or tactics, it's that they have limitless manpower, relatively speaking. So they lose a war, and they just come back and fight again, and they lose again, and they come back and they fight again, and eventually they just wear down their enemies, because their key thing of their policy is we incorporate the conquered people. And the great moment that just exemplifies this is pretty late in this process. So they've been doing this for 250 years, just about. They've gotten down to the toe of Italy. They're conquering the very last cities down there. And one of the last cities is actually a Greek city. It's a Greek colony. It's a wealthy city, and so when the Romans show up on the doorstep and are about to attack them, they do what any rich Greek colony or city does. They go out and hire the best mercenaries they can. And they hire this guy who thinks of himself as the new Alexander the Great, a man named Pyrrhus of Epirus. So he's a mercenary. He's actually related to Alexander distantly. He has a terrific army, top-notch army. He's got elephants. He's got all the latest military technology. The Romans come and fight a battle against him, and Pyrrhus knows what he's doing. He wipes out the Romans. He thinks, okay, now we'll have a peace treaty, we'll negotiate something, I can go home.